So shall I start? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Um, Good morning, good evening, everyone. My name is Prajwal Ghale. I'm the coordinator of Kathmandu University Visalma Network, Nepal. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's memorial writing session, hosted by KU Visalma Network in partnership with Atkin Chambers. We're incredibly honored to have with us Mr. Nicholas Zeolla from Atkin Chambers in London. Nicholas is here to share his experience in writing winning Moot memorials, an essential knowledge for anyone preparing to compete in this year's Moot competition, for which Atkin Chamber serves as a patron sponsor. Nicholas here brings a remarkable background to the session. He graduated at the top of his class in history at University College London and earned three prestigious scholarships from Gray's Inn to complete his law and bar studies at the City Law School. Additionally, he has studied private international law at the Hague Academy of International Law as a Michael Muscle scholar. Nicholas's own Wismut journey is inspiring. First, he competed for the Honorable Society of Gray's Inn, where he led his team to victory in the White and Case Moot in Frankfurt, and received an honorable mention in Vienna for his team's respondents memorandum. We're truly grateful to have Nicholas here with us to pass on his knowledge and experiences, which we know will be valuable to you as you prepare for your own memorials. Thank you for joining us, and special thanks to Nicholas for his time and generosity in sharing his expertise. Over to you, Nicholas.
Thanks a lot for that introduction, Prajwal. And thank you all for joining this Vismut Memorial writing session. It's organised jointly by Atkin Chambers and the KU Viz Alumni Network. Just out of interest, if you could please put into the chat where you're joining from. I'm joining from London. You might be able to see in the background the sun is slowly rising at 8 a.m. here in London, but I'd be interested to know where you're all joining from. Also London, great. So United States, good. And this is the great thing about the Vismut is it enables you to connect with people from all over the world. Yeah, we're getting all sorts of countries coming through. That's amazing. And the purpose of this session is to provide teams competing in the Vismut, whether in Vienna or Hong Kong, with a lowdown on the basics of memorial writing. As you begin to get into this year's problem, you probably already have got into the problem. You may have even started writing, but still, with 1 month to go until the deadline, this will hopefully be helpful. And by way of background, Prajwal's already mentioned some points, but my name is Nicholas Zeolla. I'm a commercial barrister at Atkin Chambers, based in London, specialising in construction, engineering, infrastructure, energy and IT litigation and arbitration, both here in the UK and globally. Atkin Chambers has a strong presence in Asia and is a patron sponsor of the Viz East Moot competition. You can see this lovely picture here of me and my teammate against the University of Geneva in the Vismut, the first year Vismut in Vienna, which was good fun. And also here's the front of our respondents memorandum, which received an honourable mention, just as a bit of proof that I have competed and I know a bit about the Vismut. But this session, thank you for the applause. But this session is really to convey the basics and to level the playing field, because there are some key tips and tricks which everyone really needs to know, and that will get your foot in the door of the Vismut. The structure of this session will be as follows. I'll start with approaching writing your Vismut memorials. That's more at the preparation stage. You may have already gone past that point, but I still think there are points there which are helpful. Second, formatting, which is at once the most boring and possibly the most important aspect of writing your Vismut memorial. I'll get on to that later. And finally, the actual writing process of your Vismut memorial. And I've got a picture here of a green hydrogen plant, I'm told, just to keep it relevant. So starting with approaching writing your memorial, first things first, you're really going to need to know and understand the issues. And I don't doubt that you've probably already started looking at them, you've started thinking about them. And that begs the initial team related question as to how you're going to split those issues up between your team. Um, at this stage, it's worth highlighting, if some teams are not aware, that your memorials and ultimately your oral advocacy should be razor focused to the four issues outlined in procedural order 1. I've put them up here on the slide. So that's 1A, B, C, and D. I won't spend too long on this because I imagine many of you have already split up these issues, but here are a couple of things to bear in mind. Procedural issues 1 and 2, which are often on procedure, and 3 and 4. And I say 1, 2, 3, 4, but that is A, B, C, D. Just be consistent when you use it. We always used to think of it in terms of 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't know why. But 1 and 2, or A and B, are usually procedure. 3 and 4 are usually CISG related. We used to call them merits. Oralists often divide up work between procedure and merits. It makes sense, and at the oral stage, you'll often be focusing on either procedure or merits. My advice would be to approach the problem at first holistically. Try not to get siloed too early on. There are often overlaps between the different issues, and the best teams are able to find a common theme throughout the Vismut problem and connect almost all of their submissions to that common theme in some way. So I would advise against being over siloed, but in terms of practicality, you will need to divide up these issues and you'll need to focus your research on each of them. As you divide up the issues, I would also advise that you make an effort to proactively get together and teach each other about what you've learned in your particular issue so that everyone's aware of the answers to all points. I've seen teams in the past go to Vienna or Hong Kong and completely understand their procedural points, but not understand how to properly answer the merits points. And I do think that is an issue in the sense that there is often some sort of overall answer to the problem or overall argument, which it helps to understand the answer to each of the issues. So that's something to bear in mind. The way you divide it up is up to you, but you should have a clear plan as to how you do that. Larger teams often have dedicated researchers who work across the issues, and that's something worth bearing in mind. We didn't, but it can work quite effectively. On to planning. Hopefully you've already done this as well. Just to highlight paragraph 44 and 47 of the rules, you have the deadlines there for the Vismut East. They may be different for Vienna, so if you're doing the Vienna Moot, don't rely upon this. But the real point here is, from an early stage, get a calendar out as a team and create deadlines for deliverables. And you want those to be quite conservative deadlines. So you want to get an early draft in, you want to have time to rework the draft, and you want to have enough float at the end to ensure that you don't have any formatting issues. It can take sometimes days to fix difficult formatting issues. And as I'll get onto in a bit, formatting issues can lead to disqualification for prizes. I've seen it happen a few times before. So you do need to have enough time, and it always ends up being a last minute thing, but it's worth at this stage planning in as much float as you can. You've got about over a month now to get the first memorandum done. It should be enough, but it's always hard work. On to the next topic for approaching writing your memorial, and that's what I've put here as research. So my understanding is that the Vismut organisers and markers are aware that different institutions have different levels of access to materials. And I think that's an important point to make, because Some universities have more arbitration books than others. So that contextualizes a team's approach to the Viz Moot. But there are plenty of materials that can be accessed freely online, and certainly enough to answer the questions that come up in the Viz Moot. And I say that because the issues this year, like every year, do bring up sort of general issues of arbitration, where there's quite a wide scholarship online. I've put two short lists of key texts, in my view, which I think will be helpful for your research. The first three there are for procedure. As many of you will know, the standard text is Gary Bourne on international commercial arbitration. Everyone refers to it, but if you've been to Vienna or Hong Kong before, you may have seen that some arbitrators might say, well, Gary Bourne on international commercial arbitration is not gospel. Fine to rely upon it, but it will not have all of the answers to the difficult issues that may come up in the Viz Moot. And that is true. So I would caution over reliance upon it, but it is the key text. And a good English text, as an English lawyer, I'd say is Mustle and Boyd on commercial arbitration. It's an older text, but in terms of key principles, it does a good job. Redfern and Hunter is a good text. It's a textbook effectively. And then CISG, and I must admit, when I did the Viz Moot, I focused on procedure and not the CISG, but I was taught a lot by my teammates on how it works and all of the references. And as you'll see, the names Kroll, Mistelis, and Perales, I'm not sure how to pronounce the third name actually, but they come up consistently. And of course, also Schwenzer. And you have that online case repository there. Part of the point of the Viz Moot is to promote the use of the CISG. So all of the necessary material and cases are easily accessible online for you. Because if it wasn't, the Moot wouldn't really function properly. But you'll have to. It's more of a, as I'll get into in the writing, and as seems to be a trend in more recent years, the Viz Moot organizers and markers are not looking for extensive references and sort of pages of source references for a point. I think in the past that used to be more common, but the rules now specify concise, accurate, and well-researched points. And it's often okay to rely upon a few good references rather than loads of tangentially relevant references, which is definitely a point bearing in mind. And we'll look through some successful memorials later on in this session, and you'll see how they've managed to keep it concise while still being accurate and well researched. Moving to the second topic of this talk, and it is truly the most boring, but also possibly the most important topic. And I say that just from past experience and seeing how tight it can get at the deadline for formatting. And if you do make any minor slip, because there are so many memoranda for the judges to mark, they will disqualify you from the prizes and not bother marking your memorial effectively. So what we're looking at here is paragraph 71 of the rules, and that gives the overall sort of marking scoring criteria. And of course, you have quality of analysis, persuasiveness of argument, thoroughness of research, clarity of writing, but they put in there and adherence to these rules. So it is, you are being scored on your ability to follow the rules as well as your substantive content. And I don't know how many points they give to it, but my impression is part of the Viz Moot, both in writing and orally, is about conforming to correct style rather than the actual content of what you say sometimes. Because in the end, most teams get to the answer in the same way or close enough. So that conformity to Viz Moot style is really important. Again, the easiest way to see whether you're achieving that is to, one, look at the rules and ensure you're complying with them, and two, look at winning memorials from the past and try and keep consistent to them. So I've said that I've seen teams be disqualified. My advice would be look at all of the specific rules and check that your formatting as planned conforms to those rules, and then check again as you begin to compile your memoranda to make sure that there are no slips. An issue I've seen is when different work products from different team members get collated. At that stage, sometimes formatting slips, and you may not notice a margin here or there, or or something along those lines slipping, and that can lead to disqualification. So be really careful. Just to whiz through the rules. I'm sure you'll be really aware of them, but they're looking for numbered paragraphs, no excessive use of authorities, and that's the point that I've said before. I think in the past there has been an issue with teams with bigger libraries referring to mountains of authorities when it doesn't really help anyone. It just sort of shows that you've got a really good library. It's better to be concise and accurate, and that's actually in the rules now. So the more you conform to that, the more points you're getting. But you will need a list of authorities, and that list of authorities needs to conform to accurate style in terms of referring, cross-referencing to the substantive body. Short citations in the main body. The type of citation they're quite broad on what type of citations you're allowed. It needs to be easily comprehensible to any audience. My recommendation would be follow that rule, but keep it as concise as possible. You'll run out of words really quickly, and you'll run out of pages really quickly. And you'll see from successful memorials that they keep it as concise as they can. And concision really is one of the best things you can be doing. And that, yeah, so it's 35 pages, which feels a lot shorter than the memorial I was producing with my team. I think maybe the limit's gone down by 5 pages actually. And probably be careful on page size and margins. I think that's the one, when I've seen disqualifications, it's been something along those lines. Font sizes conform to that, and the cover page, as the one I did before, keep to a consistent, clean style. So one last point on this, and my overall advice would be, at this stage or as early as possible, get together and agree a standard formatting for your memorial, create a template, and make sure that every team member is drafting within that template already. That will save time when you go to collate your materials so that you're not as pressured at the end. And it will also ensure that you keep consistent to the rules. But do check, regardless, at the end that nothing has slipped. Okay, so on to the meat of what you guys will all be doing over the next month or so, and then again for the respondents memorandum. So in this section, I'll look first at the appropriate style, structure, and content of a Vismut memorial, looking at the claimant's memorandum before turning to the additional considerations which you'll need to bear in mind for respondent's memorandum. So that's coming up later down the line, but it's worth bearing in mind that there are extra requirements. And here on this slide, I've set out the rules at paragraph 71, which outline how your memoranda are scored. We've already looked at the first bullet point, but this time I've emboldened the first 4 clauses, which are everything but adherence to the rules. So we're looking for quality of analysis, persuasiveness of argument, thoroughness of research, clarity of writing. Those are relatively vague requirements, to be fair. It's hard to assess whether you're ticking those boxes. So it is a bit of an overall holistic test throughout. But what they're really looking for is a really clear, concise, and precise memorandum. And the persuasiveness, I think, comes through by being engaging and really getting to the big picture argument of what's going on in your particular Vismut problem. factors that are taken into account. So that's reference to the facts in a problem and clarification. So they want it to be tied to the information that you're being given, and you have those further requirements for a respondent's memorandum. It needs to be responsive, and we'll get to that a bit later on because there is a technique to doing that, although it does vary upon the quality of the memorandum that you're responding to in many ways. My advice overall in this section would be to look at the examples of winning memorials on the Vismoot website, and they'll give you a good indication as to style. They'll show you correct and good examples of content. And the truth is, those are the memorials that have got the highest marks in previous competitions. So, regardless of any advice that I give you, that's probably the way to get high marks. But in the following sections, I'm going to look through some of those examples and give a bit of commentary, because in some ways I think they can be misleading in the sense that there are risks that you can take, and those risks sometimes are only worth taking if your team has a correct grasp of the problem. I think the next slide I've got here shows, the next two slides have a bit of an example of that. So at the beginning of your memorial, you'll create a summary of argument, and most teams will summarize the points that they're making in each section. So you'll have summary of issue A, and that will go through, these are our 3 points, this is our answer, and this is our conclusion on issue A. Summary of issue B, summary of issue C, summary of issue D. That's good practice, and you should definitely do that. Better teams, my impression is, will also summarize the overall argument and the overall point that will be made in their submissions that arises out of the Vismoot problem. Not all teams do that, and my advice or my understanding is that if you're able to distill the argument and come up with some overall point, that will get you more marks than doing it the other way. But that comes with a big caution. I think it's risky. If you get the overall argument wrong, or if it comes off too cheesy or too metaphorical, I think that can be a problem. You will see it at the oral stage, teams introducing their arguments with some grand point or argument. And it is true, once you sort of step back from the problem, that there usually is an overall point there. This example I'm showing you here was a winning memorial. This is the summary of overall argument. My initial impression is it's very metaphorical. Reading it by itself, it seems a bit strange. It doesn't seem very legal, but I've been thinking about it. I would generally advise against teams trying to attempt this unless you really think that you've got some grand theme or argument which you can distill into a clever and snappy metaphor like this. So my general advice is, don't be misled by this. This is not a requirement. You may do better by avoiding something like this and focusing on a more clinical, these are our points, and this is our analysis conclusion. I'll show you an example of that. But I just wanted to almost sort of caution against trying too much, because this can come off badly. You'd never really do this in practice as well, is a truth. I've rarely seen it in practice. Another example here which didn't win, and it's almost even more metaphorical and cheesy, but it seems to be more and more common, and it seems to get points. My internal theory is the markers are bored of marking Vismoot memorials. They've got so many to mark, and the content's all roughly the same. So teams are trying to find ways to stand out, and I think that is correct. If you want to get the highest marks, you've got to find a way to distill the overall argument in a unique and engaging way. But be careful, is my advice, because this can come off to certain markers badly, and it's not necessary. This is generally what I would advise, something more clinical and specific like this. The overall advice I give for writing your memorials, there is a clear expected structure. That is issue, law, analysis, conclusion. and effectively following that clinically throughout your memorial, which can become quite boring sometimes to read and write, which leads to that issue of how do you stand out and produce an engaging memorial. But the point is, it's a legal submission in the end, and that is what is expected of you. But this example, I think, is really good. This mirrored more what we were doing in our memorial a few years ago, setting out your overall point and how it's subdivided into subpoints and what you're asking of the tribunal. But sort of thinking about the previous memoranda we just looked at, summary of arguments, I think somewhere in the middle for most teams is probably the way to go. Having a sort of overall argumentative paragraph of why your client is correct, and then leading into quite a clinical analysis of the law, I think is probably most likely to get you the most points that you can without coming off too cheesy or metaphorical. This is an actual body of, I think, the same memorial. So no longer the summary of arguments. And this is exactly as I would recommend you produce your submissions and sort of learn from the way that this has been put together. Almost extremely concise paragraphs, one sentence paragraphs. That is effective. It goes to the point that markers have a lot of memorials to look at, and it also gets a really clear argument across. You can see here, paragraph 51, what is the issue or point? Paragraph 52, what is the relevant law? 53, more law. 54, analysis. 55, connecting that analysis, so further analysis to the facts of the case. 56, further analysis. 57, conclusion. I think any marker looking at a memorial like that will give very high marks. Worth also looking at the references here. You can see they're pretty concise. Going back, you've got Bourne, Craig, Park, Paulson, as concise as possible, and only two, which is fine, and only references to particular parts of a chapter or a single page. As long as they're accurate and correct, that's enough. You don't need sort of 5 or 10 references. But yeah, you can see it's ticking all of the boxes. So I would recommend something like this for sure. Signposting, I expect many of you will already know this, but this is crucial. It's almost a requirement of the Vismut, really. You need to distill your arguments into points, subpoints, and then reflect that in your written and oral submissions. This example shows that. You have sort of overall point being made at 17 and 18. At 19, that overall point is subdivided into points A and B. Then it leads naturally into point A. The tribunal has the power to authorize the addition of the new claim, which then is further subdivided into points I and II, and then that point starts, which further subdivides the points into points 1, 2. Any marker seeing a submission structured like this will be thinking this is correct style, these guys know what they're doing, and you'll get good marks. It also enables you to organize your arguments in a clear and effective manner. It's worth having a think about what orders you want to be using for your signposting and subdivisions. I've had a thought about it. I've put my probably third order here, which is uppercase Roman, uppercase letters, lowercase Roman, lowercase letters, and then numbers. If you make it to the fifth order, usually it's not relevant to get to the fifth order. I would try and keep it to 4 if you can. You can over subdivide in some cases. But think about what works for your team. Just throughout this PowerPoint, I was thinking if the issues are divided into A, B, C, D, maybe it's correct actually to say this is issue A, but it's up to you. It doesn't really matter. And I also think small mistake. It's worth bearing in mind that small mistakes in formatting and small mistakes in the substance and content will not jeopardize your memorials. I've seen people get prizes and make small formatting or content errors, so don't worry too much. And the final point on writing before we open up for more general questions, and this can be more of a question and answer conversation after this, but I wanted to get the basics out there first, and Prajwal will help me moderate that session after. But talking about the respondents memorandum, which is a few months away, but it will come quickly, and you don't get much of a break after putting in the claimant's memorandum before you need to start thinking about responding. You will probably be aware that you'll receive a claimant's memorandum once you've submitted your own one. That will come soon after. And that claimant's memorandum which you receive will be the one which you're responding to. So partly that exercise involves not only making your own argument as to why you are correct as respondent, but also responding effectively to the points that are raised in the claimant's argument or not raised. I've highlighted a section from the rules there at paragraph 50. There it states that it's absolutely essential that the memorandum for respondent be responsive to all the arguments made in the memorandum for claimant, as the arbitrators judging the memoranda will be evaluating it based to a large degree on how well it refutes the arguments raised by claimant. However, as the memorandum for claimant to which a memorandum for respondent is to be prepared may not have made all of the arguments, i.e., what if you get a claimant's memorandum which is completely wrong on the law or ignores all of the issues? How do you deal with that? Well, the rules state that your memorandum is to be prepared. Preparing the memorandum for respondent believes should have made, it should also address such issues indicating that the specific argument was not explicitly raised by the claimant. And it gives an example of how to do that. And that will happen. You'll think, as respondent, I want to respond to a point which was not raised. And what you'll need to say is, claimant omitted to deal with whatever point, and that's not surprising because that point is not good for claimant. Our position on that point is this, and then make your point law analysis conclusion, and that does really well. There's a caveat there in that in doing so, care should be taken to present a coherent argument for respondent and not a series of possibly disjointed responses to the claimant's argument. And that is a real difficulty, certainly something that we came up against, because not only will there be omissions of points, but the structuring of the claimant's memorandum might be all over the place. And that presents a problem. The general expectation is that you mirror the structuring of the memorandum that you're up against, even if it's strange. But you need to do so in a way where the overall argument feeds through. I'd be careful advising this, but I'm trying to think, if you, in an extreme example, if you're given a claimant's memorandum which is structured in complete ignorance to the issues in procedural order number one, and it really is all over the place, you may be at a liberty to say up front in your memorandum that this is an incorrect way of addressing the issues ordered by the tribunal. And rather than confusing the tribunal by following the structure given by claimant, we are going to follow and answer and respond to the claimant's memorandum in the correct structure. That's what you would do in practice in a real arbitration. And if you do get a really badly structured claimant's memorandum, I would advise possibly doing that, but be careful, because the general expectation is that you mirror the structure that you're given. I've given an example here. This is an example of a winning respondent's memorandum, which I think is a good example of making the respondent's point without getting too caught up in what the claimant has said. And really the way that's done here is quite clever because it almost reads like a claimant's memorandum. You have points, sort of analysis, law, and rather than relying upon the memorandum, it focuses more on what the claimant has argued in the request for arbitration, which I think is quite a clever way of feeding in the actual arguments you're meant to be responding against if the claimant has missed them. So keep that as a potential trick. But as you can see here, again, this is a really well structured and laid out analysis of the law and argument. And that's exactly what you should be aiming to do. And those are all my points that I have prepared on writing your Vismoot memorial. Here is a picture of Hong Kong, and I'll open it up to questions and answers from all of you. Feel free to put those either in the chat or turn your camera on or not and unmute yourself. And I'll be happy to answer them and we can have a bit more of a discussion. With the caveat that I'm not an expert, but I do have advice having gone through the process and from practicing as a commercial barrister.
Yes, you can speak, Smart.
Uh, Sir, we definitely received the memorandum to which we will argue in the oral rounds. That will be the memorandum we receive, or that it is just for an example, the claimant's memorandum we receive.
Sure. So you will receive a claimant's memorandum, and you will end up in the oral rounds going against that team as well. So it is good practice. A point that's worth remembering is that you are unlikely to stick to the exact arguments that you've made in your written memorials during the oral rounds. Most teams don't. Your oral argument develops almost during the pre-meet process, and no one's marking you against how closely you follow your written argument in those oral rounds, which is worth bearing in mind. And don't expect the claimant that you've responded to follow their claimant's argument. It's very unlikely that they will. They probably would have worked out their argument by the time you get to Vienna or Hong Kong.
We've got another speaker. Yeah, hi T.
Hello. You mentioned that the size of the library is not necessarily the thing that is being evaluated, but what about case law? What about how many cases you are able to bring and connect with the case you have on your hand? Is it the way that the more the better, or you still have to have a good balance?
It's a good question. The general impression that I get, and it's a trend within the Vismoot more generally, is that they're moving away from the more the better to the more precise and accurate the better. So, and that reflects what you will come across in practice. It's often not necessary to have loads of examples of something happening, but it's better to have a very close example to the exact scenario that you're talking about. But in some circumstances, if you're trying to make a difficult argument, which is a point of principle, if you can find a lot of examples showing that whatever type of behavior is not permitted in international arbitration, it will help. So I think for maybe the bigger arguments, the more maybe the better. But generally, one or two good cases is all you'll need.
Okay, thank you.
Davina.
Hi. I was just wondering, do you have any specific advice for writing good headings besides the formatting aspect, like breaking down your heading to ensure that it goes back to the point that you're trying to make? Thank you.
Also, another really good question, and not always the easiest thing because you are making some quite general arguments which you need to distill into very short headings. The first point would be consistency. Whatever you choose your headings to be, ensure that there is consistency between the contents page or summary of argument and the actual headings themselves. And second, I would say you just need to sit down and think, what in one sentence, what is my argument? And then break that down in 3 words, what is my argument? And then through that process, think, how can I make this as concise as possible? But it needs to be something pointed. I'm trying to think of what we did previously. Yeah, an example would be, the parties have not concluded a valid arbitration agreement. Very simple point without getting into any of the specific facts of the case. But then again, some teams tend towards general principles often, or bigger points of law. And for some of the procedural issues, that might work better. So for example, the sort of mediation agreement point in this year's problem is a bit more of a general issue of arbitration. So you could possibly have more of a general point there. But yeah, consistency, concision are the main things, and you'll just have to think about how you can shorten your points as much as possible.
Nicholas, before we move on to the next question, Rufus had a question for your previous answer. He said, by chance, could you also repeat the general structure of the memorandum from topic, sentence to conclusion?
I'm not sure if that was referring to signposting. If it was, this is the page, and the point there being, who asked the question? Maybe we can clarify.
Rufus, if you could please clarify.
I think it's Himani. But I think the call is being recorded as well. So if anything was missed, maybe that can be picked up in the recording. The overall point is signposts really well, and the general approach is issue, law, analysis, and conclusion quite clinically throughout.
Yeah, serious.
Hi, thank you for the session. First of all, I think we all learned a lot about memorandum drafting today. My question is with respect to what you said about responding to a claimant's memorandum when the issues are all over the place. So basically, when the issues are not in the order as given in the procedural order. However, this year's problem, for example, mentions that parties are free to choose their own order of issues. Now, if we do not necessarily believe that that should be the order that we need to follow, although it may be correct, it may not have, the order may not be incorrect. It is just the order that we do not believe is logical to follow. How do we respond to that in that sense?
Yes, thank you for bringing that up, actually. So from my experience, all teams, or almost all teams, followed the order that was in procedural order number 1 in the written memorials. But when we got to Vienna, we flipped it round, actually, because we realized that there was a more logical way to argue it. And that could be a way to stand out, but don't do it for the sake of it. Think about how best to organize your arguments. And if it does make sense to change the ordering, then take that leap to do it, but really think about and justify to yourself why you're doing that. It will often be because there's some sort of jurisdictional argument which logically precedes some other procedural points. So have a think and do change the structuring as procedural order number 1 allows you to, if you think that will make your argument most effective. But good point to raise, actually, for people to bear in mind.
Yeah, I don't know how to pronounce your names. Yeah, you. Yeah, NSTY. Please speak.
Hi. Actually, I have 3 questions, if you have some patience, but they are
Yes.
short ones.
3 is fine.
Okay, Thank you so much. This was a great presentation. Thank you, first of all. About the reference books you mentioned in the first slides, like I'm seeing 6 of them, but actually for the universities that have a limited book capacity, let's say. But the fact is that we don't have any of them. So in case we have to find them online, whether it's an ebook or Google book, something like that, it's already paid. So how can we have the access of Jusmundi, you know, because we are with participants. We have been given the Jusmundi access to some parts of it, like the search part and some parts of the online library, but not to all. So how can we have access to these 6 basic books at least, if not more? This was my first question.
Yeah. Okay, should we do that question first?
Yeah.
I mean, my overall point was, I do think Markers and Vismoot organisers contextualise the way they approach different memorials on the basis of access to materials. They understand that not everyone has access to the key texts. I gave some examples which generally from my London-based perspective, we used a lot, but be as creative and use whatever search engines that you have provided to you to answer the questions, because as I said, these are often of general importance or general principle points, which can be answered in different ways, and you might even end up having better answers to the questions with different resources than the ones I've got. But it is, I mean, the main point to remember is that it is understood that access to resources is limited in some places.
Okay, so at least we'll have some excerpts from them in some online resources or anything. And because they are excerpts, I think we should be able to write them on the reference site at least.
Yes.
Okay.
For sure.
Thank you. The second question, this is the first time we participate to Vismoot as members of the team. And what I'm trying to understand is that universities participate to pre-Vismoots more or less. We, for example, intend to participate in one locally. But at the end of the day, the teams hearing each other's arguments come to a point before the oral one in Vienna. More or less, everybody hears the other's perspectives, others' arguments. So what differentiates the teams in Vienna? So everybody knows others' perspective at the end. Yeah.
And honestly, the consistent argument that teams end up taking develops in Vienna itself. You'll see everyone sort of herds towards a common theme in the submissions. And to be honest with you, my view is that the content becomes less important the closer you get to Vienna. And what becomes more important is style and presentation, because the reality is almost all the teams are making the same arguments. So what you want to be really preparing is almost reflecting your written skills in your oral advocacy with clear signposting. And the plan is to organize a second session actually on Vismoot advocacy closer to the time, where in a longer form, I can go through some of these things in more detail. But you are picking up on something which does become very real, and it becomes a bit more training about training your advocacy at that stage.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. And the last question is, because we have some limitations on resources, as I mentioned in the first question, is it possible to make use of other arbitration institute cases, or are we limited to only Finland Arbitration Institute? Because there are a lot of cases about ICC, ICSID, and so on, American Arbitration Association. Can we make use of them, or are they irrelevant?
Absolutely. Do not just use Finland arbitration cases. The procedural law will not always be determinative of the procedural issues, and similar issues will have come up in ICC or other arbitrations. So if you can draw any similarity or analogy between those cases, do use them. And to be honest, some are more well respected than others. I'd expect you to be using a lot of ICC cases. You have a lot of good case law in there, and especially for the general principles of international arbitration, there's been some great reported cases.
Just to be clear, finally, should we use other arbitration institute cases just for the procedural part, or can we use them for the substantial part too?
Yep, for both.
Okay.
I think the CISG case repository is probably best for the merits, but whatever you find that's relevant, if you think it's relevant, feel free to use it
Thank
and
you so
explain
much.
why it's relevant.
Thank you.
I think we have another question here. Bible.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much for the session, first of all. My question is kind of connected to the question that was asked before. So in my experience of researching, I found that the American practice to and approach to arbitration is a bit different than other common law practices. My question is, can we put it under the same spectrum of common law practices in general around the world, or do we distinctly distinguish them from other practices? And can we like have a direct approach only based on US practices? Thank you.
Yeah, that's another good question. Something you should be aware of is the differences between civil law and common law jurisdictions, and really get into why there are differences and what impact that's likely to have on the approaches of different tribunals to different points of principle. Often that's where the effect is. I remember for our Vismu, which was similar in many ways to the issues that were coming up here, was to do with whether the state can rely upon its own legislation to avoid a contract effectively. We looked a lot at French jurisprudence and sort of transnational arbitral theory. So it's using that kind of academic or differences between legal theory is helpful. And when referring to cases, you can note this was a civil law case if it's a domestic piece of legislation, and that's why it came. But in all honesty, that's probably too fine an analysis for the Vismu. You probably won't need to go into that much detail, but that awareness is helpful.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
That's all right.
I think we had another person who raised their hand, and I think it will be our last question. I
Hello.
guess, yeah.
Hi. Yeah, so my question is in connection to the previous question that you'd answered with regard to resources. So we're from India, and I mean the procedural rules that have been adopted are the Finland arbitration rules, and there's virtually no commentary out there that is accessible to us to interpret these rules at all. What would you suggest how we go ahead with that? Because I mean, yes, we could use the ICC and other institutional rules, but with like virtually no commentary on the Finnish rules themselves, how do you suggest we go ahead with it?
Yeah, and my answer is quite similar to before, but I guess I can go into more specific detail. It may be the case, and if it is the case, that there is no commentary on the FIA rules. Your first point in your submission is there's currently no commentary on the FIA rules on this issue. And the second point is this issue is regardless of general application, and it comes up in all sorts of jurisdictions, and you'll show how it's been treated in those different jurisdictions and how the commentary on the different rules has responded to it. Because I do think the issues that come up are of general importance, and it's fine to make those points of general principle by reference to different rules. You may need to be careful as to whether those different rules have different provisions which affect the commentary. But apart from that, I think in general terms, you can make points of general principle by reference to ICC or whatever case it is, and note the fact that there is no specific commentary on the rules in question. That's what you would do in practice, I think.
Samira, I think Nicholas is going to be our last question because we're nearing the end of our session.
Hi. My question is, what sort of tone should we aim for in like the memorial to remain professional yet persuasive? Are there like any phrases or styles we should use to avoid it and keep it concise?
Yeah, I would say don't try not to use anything really. Few words as possible to make the point that you're trying to make. So I showed this example, and I think keep something like this. I think this is stuff like furthermore in specific terms of phrase that I would recommend using. And sometimes it will look less professional trying to put in terms of phrase that you may think are correct or sound legal. So be careful of that. But generally, just use as few words as possible and use correct connecting terms and phrases would be my advice. Okay, Prajwal, I'm not sure if I've lost you.
No, I'm here. I think we're done for today. We're nearing the end of our session. Um, we'd like to thank Nicholas for his presentation today on Memorial. I hope it was helpful to all the participants because a lot of topics that Nicholas delved into were the kind of things that I would have wanted last year to have known about before starting a memorial process because I had to go through all of those processes by myself and had to discover all of these tips on the way. I hope this session has put all of the participants at least on a level playing ground. So yeah, thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you all for joining. I hope it was helpful, and we'll be looking to do a oral advocacy session in the new year. Is the plan?
Yeah, keep looking forward for our next session. We've included a feedback form in the chat. Please fill it up so that we'll be able to help you with the next session. Yeah, and the link to the recording will be also sent to the forms. So yeah, please keep posted. Yeah, thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you.